If a 10-year-old Noahide steals, is he liable? What about a 15-year-old? Or do we wait until 25 when psychology says the brain is fully developed? At what age do Noahides actually become accountable under God's law? In this video, we'll look at what the Torah says about the matter, because it's not super obvious. For Jews, a boy becomes liable at age 13 and a girl becomes liable at age 12. But this is only if they show signs of puberty, namely 2 pubic hairs. But don't worry, they don't actually check pubic hairs unless a case actually requires it. Many authorities, including Maimonides, apply this same standard to non-Jews, but it doesn't actually tell the whole story. For example, the reasons that Jews follow this law is different from the reason that non-Jews would follow the law. So let's get into it. First, where do these ages actually come from, 12 and 13? You might expect the Torah to say the ages clearly, but it actually doesn't. The ages 13 and 12 were actually handed down orally at Sinai. Because these numbers, 13 and 12, can't be easily derived by reason or logic, they're known as suprarational decrees. Think about it. If you only read the Torah, would you have guessed 13, 12, 2 pubic hairs? Likely not. But notice something about the marker for liability. The oral law doesn't solely rely on age. It also requires signs of puberty, the 2 pubic hairs. This shows us that adulthood is not just merely a matter of birthdays. It's more about maturity. And that's what's important for us Noahides. Because this law was handed down orally, and because there's no explicit verse in the Torah, and because the numbers are also super-rational, we can't just derive them via logic. Unlike Jews, who are required to follow both super-rational and rational laws, the super-rational part doesn't apply to us Noahides. The core that applies to us is the marker from childhood to adulthood, maturity, which can easily be seen by the onset of puberty. Again, because Noahide law is grounded in reason, the rational aspect of the law from Sinai, which is puberty, which marks an inflection point in moral understanding, plays the central role in defining the liability cutoff for non-Jews. In other words, we're not required to follow the supra-rational numbers. Now, before we go further, I think you guys would find it interesting that Rashi actually finds a scriptural hint to the liability age. How did he find it? Well, the oral tradition typically relays the ages of many biblical figures at the time of their actions. Thus, Rashi picked out the places where the Torah refers to somebody as a man versus as a boy, and then he calculated the lowest age at which the Torah refers to somebody as a man. And that age, indeed, is 13 years old. After the rape of Dinah, Genesis 34:25 says, "And the 2 sons of Jacob, Shimon and Levi, took each man his sword." The oral tradition tells us that Shimon and Levi were 13 years old at this time, and the verse calls them men, not boys. But cool note aside, let's go back to non-Jews. Maimonides, the chief codifier of Noahide law, writes in Laws of Kings chapter 10 that 3 categories of Gentiles are never punished: a katan, a minor; a cheresh, a deaf mute, who in Talmudic times were considered incapable of communication; and a shoteh, an insane person. Why these 3? The oral Torah says that it is because all 3 of them lack da'at, which from the Hebrew roughly translates into knowledge and the ability to make sound, responsible judgment. A minor hasn't yet developed it, the insane person has lost it, and the deaf mute in earlier eras was presumed never to acquire it. Crucially though, Maimonides does not distinguish between Jewish minors and non-Jewish minors. So the straightforward interpretation is that there is actually no difference. But there actually is a difference, and it's only a difference in the reason why we follow it. It harkens back to the rational, super-rational decrees that we mentioned earlier. For Jews, remember the cutoff is 13 for boys, 12 for girls, plus marks of puberty. The numbers themselves, though, are the anchors to the law. They only follow it because God gave them the numbers. For non-Jews, though, the core of the matter is the maturity that puberty represents. That's the rational aspect of the Jewish law. Thus, the numbers, the super-rational numbers, aren't binding in the same way for non-Jews. What matters for non-Jews is reaching moral discernment. And in practice, this typically lines up with the ages 13 for boys and 12 for girls, which is why many authorities, including Rabbi Moshe Weiner, who wrote the Divine Code, simply apply the same 13-12 standard for non-Jews, provided that they have reached puberty. Why? Again, Maimonides doesn't make a distinction between Jewish minors and Gentile minors. Now you may find though that other sources emphasize the rational side, the maturity side, which puberty signals. From that view, a Noahide court could, in theory, judge case by case whether someone has reached maturity. But the most consistent approach seems to be this. Maimonides doesn't distinguish. God's decree that boys below the age of 13 are not adults and girls are also not adults below the age of 12 tells us he doesn't want anybody below those ages to be held liable. And then the additional requirement of 2 pubic hairs reinforces that puberty is necessary. And since this is a matter of scriptural law, remember that the obligation for justice is one of the 7 Noahide commandments. We follow the strict standard because we don't want to get it wrong. Further, imagine if we risked punishing an actual true minor. That would be devastating. Now let's face some objections. Some might object that human brains aren't fully developed until age 25. So why would the Torah draw the line that much earlier? The answer is that the Torah distinguishes between moral understanding and impulse control. A 13-year-old may not yet have perfect self-control, but in a Noahide society, he would understand the difference between murder and theft, kindness, honesty, all of the moral aspects. And according to the Oral Torah, it is this moral discernment that separates an adult from a child for liability. Another objection is that some may think that Jews develop maturity faster than non-Jews. While it may appear that way today, that difference only comes from early Torah education, not biology. In the future, when Noahide societies also raise their children in the sole purpose of knowing God, there should be no real gap in development. So what are some practical takeaways for today? Because remember, we're only talking about idyllic Noahide societies. First, if you have transgressed one of the 7 commandments after the age of 13 and 12, respectively, don't worry. The criteria for liability is different right now because we don't actually live in a Noahide society where everybody just knows the laws. Today, God only asks for your repentance. And something else, if you are a parent of a child below those ages, you are actually obligated under the command for justice to provide education for your child, most specifically moral education in the Noahide Code. So now let's summarize. For Jews, children become responsible and liable for their actions at age 13 for boys and 12 for girls, provided that they have at least 2 pubic hairs. Why? Because God commanded it to Moses at Mount Sinai. For non-Jews, the Oral Torah tells us that we're not allowed to prosecute children. Though we don't need to follow those suprarational numbers, we do need to follow the rational part, which is moral understanding, which is typically signified from the onset of puberty. In a Noahide society, this would probably line up with the ages that are for the Jews, 13 for boys and 12 for girls. Now, because Maimonides, the strictest opinion, doesn't distinguish between Gentile children and Jewish children, future Noahide societies should also follow those numbers. I know this video kind of got into the weeds. All I really had to say was that we just follow the Jews' numbers, but I wanted to clarify for those who actually want to know the law like I do, that we don't follow those numbers just because we're supposed to follow those numbers. We really only follow the onset of moral maturity, which in the future should definitely line up with the ages set for the Jews. Hopefully all of this made sense. I tried to research it pretty extensively. Remember, God always accepts sincere repentance. If you have children, please teach them about the Noahide Code. I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you for watching.